Hello, Eric Walzakowski here, host of Tailored Talent and CEO of Bespoke Partners. Today, I'm joined by Patrick Dennis, the CEO of Avaya. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Great. One of the things I was most excited about, Patrick, in talking to you is you've seen scale at all levels. You've been an operator inside big companies, and you're a multi-time CEO with many exits. And so one of the things I was hoping to dive into today is to talk to you a little bit about how you see value creation when you step into a new opportunity.
Okay. That's, I guess that's sort of the big topic for folks like me when, folks like you are doing your day job, you're asking me how we think about it. So I guess that's probably a good place to start.
For sure.
Well, I guess let's maybe start here. I primarily do software, right? And so I do think there's some things where I think industry matters, and probably for the people that, listen to this, that's not unusual for them either to be focused in that particular market. And I'd say like some things are repeatable and some things are unique. Generally, my stack rank includes, not surprisingly, there's some talent transformation that's going to take place. There's usually some pricing and packaging element that's going to take place. There's usually some go-to-market activity that's going to take place, whether that's adding channels, removing channels, changing direct selling relationships, how you work with partners, right? Like technology partners. So there's usually some go-to-market component. And then candidly, if you work in private equity, which tends to be where I spend my time, there is still a keener eye to efficiency than I think a lot of people tend to think. And so some amount of rationalization on spend is typically part of what you would do. People often think that's cost cutting. It's not always a cut. It's oftentimes a reallocation. It's like, hey, the right number of dollars are getting spent, but they're not being spent in the right places. So, those elements exist in almost every engagement that I've been a part of.
No, fantastic. And I appreciate you giving me the overview. Let's see if we can't, take it down to set the scene. So private equity firm calls you up. Patrick, you're the new CEO. Do you take their value creation plan at face value? Or when you get in there, do you get into the details? Do you bring an external firm in to help you assess that? How do you set the stage for what you're going to undertake for a 3 to 5 year journey?
Yeah, the place that I like to start, and people, meaning firms are sometimes a little scared of this. Like, I actually just want to see the deal model. And sometimes people feel like there's some secret formula to that. I sort of feel like the deal model is true north. And so if somebody isn't willing to share true north with you, then I'm just not interested. I think sometimes folks feel like you might change your perspective on performance. Maybe you won't work as hard if you don't I don't think any of that stuff is really true. If everybody's in this game to produce a good outcome and create great results, I think the first question is what's the deal model look like? And then we can talk about how we want to outperform it, because we certainly do. So for me, that's the first thing. Then what is underlying the thesis that led to the deal is sort of the second thing. There's typically, depending on the firm, one way you hear that described is, what do you have to believe? I've heard that used by a few different firms. But what are the 3 or 4 points that underwrite the deal thesis? And then typically I do a bit of my own research outside in against whether or not those 3 or 4 points, now that you understand what they are and you've seen them in the deal model, then you can better kind of quantify, are these things rational?
No, fantastic. And I love how you start with, hey, let's get the facts on the table and what we're trying to accomplish here. And it's one of the things when we help CEOs place into a new situation is to try to provide that transparency, because nothing is more frustrating than not knowing where you're trying to go.
Well, and you all are a great example of it, right? I'll act like I know something about your line of work for a minute, but if somebody just calls you up and says they want a CEO, that's not enough information for you, right? Well, when people call up and they're like, I want to exit a software company, I'm like, okay, that's great. I think we're going to have to do we have to do a little more work before we can figure out how to do that, right?
Right.
Yeah. So once you get through some of those elements, I do think the outside in work, I will say this, is important. But because the thing, if you're being intellectually honest, you have to take away from the equation the "they tricked you" element. I think especially in the type of roles that you folks are typically looking at, I'm sorry, there's really no excuse for getting surprised. If you do the right amount of work up front, there shouldn't be a lot of surprises.
Yep.
And by the way, in doing that, there should be some things that aren't perfect. Otherwise, why would you be doing a leadership change, right? So, again, kind of map back to what was the deal model? What are the points in the thesis? Let's do some work that's outside in. And by the way, sometimes you find some of the initial points in the thesis were on the green, but, not yet putted to the hole. And that's okay. You sometimes have to just redefine some of those things together. I think you're better off pushing and pulling on that early versus trying to do that late.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the things that I've done myself, and we help our CEOs is negotiate that through the process of before you select the role. Talk to me a little bit about that give and take and how you've gone through that with some of the sponsors you've worked with as you're assessing the opportunity.
So if I break it down into two categories of push and pull, well, maybe three, you're going to have some financial push and pull. They're probably going to have their strongest feelings there, and maybe even their most credible point of view. Okay. So some amount of that might have to happen. There's operational push and pull, probably where the CEO has the most credible point of view. Okay. And testing those boundary conditions in those two is pretty important. Because if you're going to work together like a team, you want to believe that the other person has domain expertise you don't have, and you want to believe they're going to be a rational actor, which sort of leads to my third point, which I hesitated when I said two. I'm adding the third because I think this is like an important thing to test too. Like, how are you going to govern the relationship? So for instance, should the private equity firm and the board participate perhaps in selection of some of the key executives on the team? Yes, probably should. Is that decision ultimately the CEO's? Absolutely. So maybe some CEOs don't feel as strong about that as I do, but I do want very clear boundary conditions on certain things. Hiring executives is one of those things. And then there's some that are like really, really entirely collaborative. I don't think you can set an annual operating plan without both of you sort of looking at each other and saying like, yeah, okay, that's the right AOP. So, if I were to kind of pick through, you're going to push on some financial things, you probably have to do more listening there. You're probably going to push on some operational things. You should be the expert there, and then through that process, trying to figure out how you're going to work together, like the governance in the relationship, not to use an overly fancy word, is probably an important thing to do. Trying to test those things before you actually have to run a company with those people is, I think, pretty important. So, you started with like, where's your value creation plan and how do you think through it? Like, one of the reasons I want to think through those things ahead of time is, well, I may have some early thoughts on where the push and pull might be, and maybe they're not perfectly formed. There's a lot of value in some early push and pull in a relationship just to see how it's going to work.
No, I love it. So financial, operational, and governance. I want to start pivoting now into the people side of things. And since you did bring up governance, let's talk a little bit about board formation as you go in. Personally, I'm a big believer in independent directors sitting next to private equity firms, but curious how you go through that when you negotiate what governance looks like.
It's interesting. My first CEO gig was a public company, which is sort of unusual. And I wound up hiring a board director. And at the time, I did not take it seriously enough. So like, I'm going to see these people once a quarter. Like, I was just too green to know. And I guess to the extent there's anybody that's listening to this that like has not done this a few times, or maybe even is their first time, or maybe they're thinking about doing it. It is one of the more important things you're going to do.
Yep.
So if you are in the place I was, which was naive, go find some person that's done it for a long time and get a primer from them, off book on the things you should consider. Pause. Now you're asking a composition question. Sometimes that really can't be negotiated. So for instance, I'll just take this existing company. It's structured in the shareholder agreement. And so you can't really negotiate the structure. What you can always negotiate are the people. And, I think that matters more. So, for me, I'm more of the, let's just make sure we have the smartest, most capable people around the table. I do think adding independence is useful. That doesn't necessarily mean I think large counts are useful. So, I do think the other element on boards that has gotten to be a little too comfortable lately is that you can have 8, 9, 10 person boards. I'm not necessarily a fan of boards that are that big.
Yep.
I think for what it's worth, I think the trade-off is speed and nimbleness. And in this market, in the conditions of this market, meaning present, and in this market, meaning software, speed is such an important element. I have a hard time making speed trade-offs.
For sure. No, I think board size, speed, accountability is very important within that, but that independence of thought and diversity where you've got different perspectives and expertise sitting around the table is just so powerful. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, and I do think that's what you're seeking. Like the reason why that's so powerful is, let's just take a narrow band example. It is one company acquired by one firm, okay, and that firm's deal team is now on the board. Well, that's going to be a fairly limited set of views. As a firm, they have a thesis on what they buy. They have discipline around that. So like you're going to have a fairly narrow view. Doesn't mean bad, just means narrow view of the world. And you will miss the things that are not inside that field of view. Whereas you're right, adding independence at least helps open the aperture for discussion. And I do think that that's important. I've served in both roles as an independent director. I've certainly been a director on a board as a CEO. I've been a director on a board on behalf of a firm. Each of those roles is a little bit different. I do think when you're adding an independent director, you at least open up the field of view, and that's smart.
For sure. And I think, it's important to note something you pointed out. The structure of the board is typically set up in the bylaws. And so maybe the notion of independent is getting a subject matter expert as a private equities proxy around the table. And so when we think about that, how do you use, whether it's domain expertise in the particular software subsector or along the value creation side, whether it's functional expertise, how do you think about that when you start to shape your board?
Ideally, you have a director available to backstop the most complicated aspect of the value creation plan. So, I'll give like 2 or 3 examples. There's a cybersecurity company I ran, and we had a director who had deep cyber experience as an operator and could help really think through how you take to market that particular product to a cybersecurity and specifically a chief security officer buyer. Because that was a hyper growth deal, that was really, really important. And so matching up the director with those skills, with that part of the value creation plan that was going to have an outsized impact was smart. Here at Avaya, there are some really complex financial things that need to be worked through. So I have a really strong independent director that has CFO background and is also the audit committee chair. He's exceptional. He's exceptionally useful at this company because of that complexity. So I think, my first pass filter would be, where is the highest impact, highest complexity mix? And can you find a director that can backstop you there? Probably shortly followed by, if you really have a weak spot or a flat spot relative to the company that you're going to run, the benefit of having a director with those competencies, in addition to whomever you're going to hire in the company to offset it, you sort of don't want to, you have to still be able to run your leadership team the right way. And so having a sounding board that has those skills that you might not have so that you can better lead the person that's in that spot is pretty important. Those would probably be my first 2.
For sure. Well, Patrick, we are sticklers here to keep people on time, and I could talk to you all day. So I appreciate you coming on and hope you have an amazing day.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate you having me.